policy should be vested at the level of the nation state. Another argument is it's only at the nation state level you have that instinctive social solidarity that will allow you to support welfare. And you've seen this argument played out in the context of the Scottish independence debate quite recently, and indeed just yesterday. How do you protect welfare? Is it Scottish independence, more devolution, or is it going back to the centre? That's a very simplistic hypothesis. But it was the start of my inquiry into this. I looked at what's happening in a number of countries. There's the UK, there is Spain, which is quite similar in many ways in its model of devolution. There was Italy and there's Belgium, chosen because they've recently had experiences of decentralization. Systems are continually in flux, and because those particular cases do raise this question, how far devolution goes into social policy. And what I found is a very mixed experience. I look at a number of policy areas which are relevant to this, all have a kind of commitment to combat social inequality. That is, they will all tell you, oh no, we're not going to engage in a race to the bottom. Well, I can give you one exception to that, a couple of exceptions to that, just to show that these meaningful choices are made. But generally speaking, oh yes, we're all in favour of social inclusion or whatever the buzzword is at the time. But that takes very different forms. So I looked at a number of policy instruments that devolved governments might have to do this. The first being taxation. There's been quite a lot of devolution of taxation in Spain to some degree, in Italy, a bit in Belgium as well. Taxes are an obvious way to tackle social inequality, and tax powers are available in all of these places. They're hardly ever used. This is really striking. Scotland is not exceptional in having a tiny little bit more progressivity in the tax system. We can come back to the reasons for that later on. One or two exceptions, the outliers are always interesting because they show that the finding itself is meaningful. The Autonomous Community of Madrid in Spain had, and at one point Catalonia did have, an aggressive tax-cutting policy, cutting back on services. But generally speaking, that doesn't happen. There's not a move upwards of taxes or downwards of taxes. Instead of a race to the bottom or a race to the top, we've got a race to the middle. Another thing that is very striking is in models of public service delivery. There are huge differences there to the degree to which governments practice this new public management, as we used to call it, because it's not new anymore, but about contracting out and competition in public services rather than the traditional model of public service delivery. And, of course, the promoters of the new public management would always say, it doesn't have any distributional consequences, it's just a neutral instrument. Well, there's no such thing as a neutral instrument. It does have implications, and we do find big differences in all these cases between those places that are going for that model of public service delivery and those that aren't. Again, we could expand on that later on. Big differences also in whether these regions, let's call them regions for a moment. I know we have that argument in Scotland. Don't call it a region, but let's just call them regions for a moment. Or we can call them meso-level territories if you like. that's how we get around that. But anyway, in some territories there is a strong commitment to universal provision. This is not quite the same as the new public management argument, versus selectivity. We see this in university fees, whether available, health service charges, charges for social care, charges for childcare, and so on. Again, this is an instrument that is used quite a lot, and we see a big difference. And we know there's an argument in the welfare state literature as whether universality or selectivity are really progressive. You can argue it both ways. But certainly it is there, and it does have distributional consequences. Another policy field that was quite important was labour market policy, particularly active labour market policy, because right across Europe this is being devolved to that intermediate level very, very widely. And I picked this up in a project a few years ago. The way that these territories use that policy can either be try and get people into the labour force, that is, get people who are difficult to bring into the labour force, or just take these people already close to employment who don't need a lot of training. That's a big difference there in how they handle that and the way that labour market policy is linked to welfare instruments. There are differences in payments when increasingly devolved governments are administering cash payments. That was hardly the case at all 20 or 30 years ago. Increasingly that's the case. And Scotland is absolutely stable. You get a little bit more, a few more discretionary payments available. And big differences, because here it's the young people, there it's old people, here it's children, here it's big families. Discretion is exercised in who are seen as the deserving recipients of this kind of largesse. And then we have, going on for a long time in Spain, but picked up elsewhere, minimum income guarantees. That's something that's just come into Scotland. It's being experimented here and in Wales as well. Filling in the gaps in welfare provision by having an income guarantee that is normally complementary to national welfare policies, but it started off in Southern Europe where it was an incomplete welfare state, and so there are lots of gaps to be filled. This started off in the Basque Country and it's rapidly picked up. Classic argument of a race to the top. Finally, how do we explain these differences? Well, it's partly about left-right politics, which is what you would expect. Centre-left regions being more redistributed, centre-right regions being more in favour of tax cutting and new public managements and so on. That's not the only thing, though. There's also what we call these policy communities. That is, how the relations between labour and employers and social movements in the third sector reconfigure at different levels, so that different groups have power at different levels. The political arena is restructured at different levels, and it tilts to the right or it tilts to the left or tilts towards more collectivist policies or more individualist policies. That explains a lot of the difference. And Paul started working with me about 20 years ago on a study in the UK looking at this territorialization of interest groups and the extent to which there's social dialogue at that territorial level. There's not a lot of social dialogue in Scotland. People talk to themselves a lot in Scotland, but they don't really talk to each other. But in other places, we get these bargains amongst different groups and generating, in the optimistic scenario, social investment and social capital so that spending on public services generates an economic benefit. It's difficult to think of a good example of that, but that's the kind of mythical Nordic model of self-sustaining social expenditure. So really, that's a quick review of what I've been looking at. This is an area that has yet to be explored fully, getting down into the detail. But what we can see is that there's a whole lot of things that we can learn from, and that decentralization doesn't necessarily lead to a race to the bottom. It does lead to differentiation in social provision, and this really is quite important in understanding the modern welfare state. So I said I'd keep to 10 minutes because I wanted everybody else to, and I've succeeded. So now I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I just want to say big thank you to Paul, Michael, Emily and Sean and the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me along. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be here. So my intervention is going to be about the research I've undertaken over the past 6 years or so, and which has led to the recent publication of my first book here, and it's entitled The Politics of Health Promotion in the European Union. And I would like to start by talking a little bit about its cover. I know we say don't judge a book by its cover, but on this occasion I put a lot of effort and thought into trying to capture with an image what kind of arguments are in it. So if you don't see it, it's a concrete with a crack in it and a plaster on top of it. And so, health inequalities, which are socioeconomic inequalities, are running deep, and health promotion policy efforts to tackle this issue remain quite superficial, like a plaster. And this is not due to lack of evidence or lack of knowledge, because as we all know, there's plenty of excellent research on the topic. So how come the availability of so much evidence on why and how inequalities are bad for health, and all the effort to translate that knowledge into policy ideas still doesn't seem to be enough to lead to proper kind of meaningful change? And at the core here, I'm interested in the relationship between research and policy, and grounding it empirically, I'm also interested in seeing how that relationship plays out at an institutional setting, and in this particular case, the EU. So one small disclaimer here is that I'm afraid my book is not about Scotland per se. I look at the EU institution, in particular the European Commission, but I think that some of the themes and arguments I hope can speak to other governance spaces as well. So why look at the EU even, one might ask? And perhaps since COVID this is no longer the case, but when I started my research, people were sometimes perplexed and wondering why I would want to look at health promotion policy agenda in an institution that is notoriously not mandated to govern public health. And so for one, the EU does regulate and govern public health in quite a few ways, although often not through competencies that are related to public health. But also the so-called causes of health inequalities, or we can call them macrosocial determinants of health, are not governed through public health policy. And if health inequalities result from socioeconomic inequalities, then policies that affect socioeconomic inequalities do pertain to health, even if sometimes indirectly. And here we are very much in EU competence territory, because we're dealing with things like fiscal constraints and market regulation. And therefore, I think the EU is particularly important to look at also from a multi-level governance perspective, because of the scope it has to shape, constrain, or enable a member state domestic policy space. And so recognizing that this dimension pertain to health opens up the possibility to really kind of broaden the scope for what even constitute health promotion. Because health promotion is often defined very narrowly. One thinks of education campaigns or efforts to modify individual behaviors. But we know that the impact of those kinds of approaches, while they of course may have merit, is rather limited. And a broader definition of health promotion, I would suggest, might be a useful start to talk about the root causes of health inequalities. But at the same time, it opens up a kind of a messy box of everything becomes health. And it raises the question of where and how do you draw any lines. And this is what the advocates of the EU's health mainstreaming agenda are concerned with. And yes, the EU has indeed a health mainstreaming agenda. It's called Health in All Policies, or HIAP for short. And it was first introduced by the Finnish presidency in 2006. The concept of HIAP, which is by no means specific to the EU as well, is based on recognizing that non-health policy areas do affect health, and that if we want to improve population health and well-being, then policies in any domain should consider how they shape health. And so HIAP was very much welcome in the Council, it was welcome in the Commission, and it echoes, for example, Article 168 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, that states, and I quote, that a high level of human health protection shall be ensured in the definition and implementation of all union policies and activities, and also Article 9, which is about horizontal social clauses. But despite this enthusiasm, and this enthusiasm for taking up the idea, HIAP has not really led to any kind of fundamental, meaningful change. And my book takes a critical social scientific lens to explore why this might be the case. And the reason I explicitly mention critical social scientific is because that contrasts with much, although not all, of the work that has looked at HIAP, but more from a technical perspective. And what I would suggest is that implementing HIAP is not so much a technical task as it is a political one. And by political, I mean, dynamics pertaining to different types and forms of powers. We talk about institutional power, but also power present in ideas and in discourses. And now I'm going to just jump, because I'm going to try and keep to 10 minutes as well, to give you a brief overview of the main findings. And so one reason, one reason that HIAP fails to bring about meaningful change at EU level, I would say, is quite simply related to institutional constraints. EU governance areas that are dealt with in the most binding and hard way tend to be the ones that have the least perceived relevance to HIAP, although they are precisely the ones that relate to macrosocial determinants of health, single market, economic governance since the Eurozone crisis, and so on. On the other hand, EU governance areas that have the most perceived relevance to HIAP are very soft and voluntary and non-binding, and mostly relate to the traditionally kind of narrow understanding of health promotion. And much of that is focused on promoting healthy lifestyles and so on. And this situation is not at all surprising, because it reflects what other scholars have called constitutional asymmetry, which refers to how the EU integrates much smoother, much more rapidly in economic areas and market-creating areas, and it's much more difficult to integrate on social issues. Secondly, though, I would argue that this asymmetry doesn't just sustain itself, but is actively reproduced and reinforced through ideas, ideas that structure how EU policymakers make sense of health, but also how they make sense of knowledge and evidence, and what represents and what constitutes usable, legitimate evidence. And one aspect here is the metric-driven way the European Commission operates. The importance attributed to quantifiability over other types of research policy relationship and its aura of neutrality and objectivity is, I would say, an obstacle when dealing with so-called wicked problems where linear causality is quite difficult or sometimes even impossible to isolate, and when norms matter enormously. And this leads me to my final point, which is perhaps less about the EU and more about HIAP itself. If the EU is so economy-driven and doesn't do much on social things and on health, how come HIAP managed to get itself on the agenda in the first place? And so first, okay, I should say that this statement right now is maybe a little bit unfair because the EU is not monolithical. But I would also say that this relative success lies very much in how HIAP is packaged as an idea. And here I draw on some existing literature on different types of idea and suggest that HIAP is one of those so-called chameleonic ideas. That means that it's intentionally tailored to fit the governance space that it targets. And accordingly, its normative essence is intentionally, strategically toned down in order to reach the EU space. But what this results in is a vague concept that indeed travels well, and everyone can get behind, but that is particularly prone to being co-opted, watered down, or redefined, reinterpreted. And so the politics of defining HIAP, I think, is very interesting. And in response of those kind of tensions around defining HIAP, HIAP advocates tend to have to recycle and repackage the same chameleonic idea over and over again, but under a different name, under a different buzzwords, depending on, also on where we are. And so the last point I make is that the nature of HIAP itself as an idea might also play a role in why, okay, it made it onto the EU agenda, but it failed to lead to any fundamental change. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlotte. Very well timed. Okay. I've just been reminded to remind you that this event is being recorded and live streamed. And for those of us who are joining us online, you can submit questions by a YouTube channel by leaving a comment. That will be in the discussion, and Talia will then pick up those questions. Okay, so let's move on to the next speaker, Paul.
Thank you. So I was going to do the Michael thing and do this all from memory, but I don't think I've spoken in public since February 2020. I think all my energy is going to be focused on volume. Okay, so I thought I'm just going to forget everything if I don't write it down. Okay, so we wrote this book. Ours isn't out, so we don't have it's a lovely cover. I just can't show you it. Okay, but it's free. Ours is free. So we wrote it during this, what has proven to be a lull between two Scottish referendums. Okay, and so we didn't really, we thought we were done for a while, but they're kind of pulling us back in. So I think independence talk is back on the agenda, and I think we're back to the idea, I think, that an independent Scotland would be wealthier and fairer. And I suppose as soon as I heard that again, then it's very hard to ignore. It's kind of infused throughout everything we say, even though the book doesn't really focus on Scotland. It focuses on the EU and international type of experiences. But that kind of focus allows us to interrogate some key claims about, if can smaller states be wealthier and fairer, and what is the experience of states and regions when they make those claims and they try to pursue those policies. So the first thing we would talk about is this idea of if you're on live stream, you can't hear the bagpipes. There's someone heckling me with the bagpipes. Okay, so the first thing is this idea of policy ambiguity. So the question for us is, what does equity or what does fairness mean? So lots of governments like to talk about more equitable society or policies or fairer policies, but what do they mean? And I think there are two things to say. The first is that ambiguity is really useful when you're making campaigns. You don't have to define it. In fact, you'll go out of your way not to define fairness because it's an excellent word that people can get behind without really making sense of it. But it's not particularly useful when people are trying to make concrete policy designs or decisions. And its meaning varies by context. Now, so Michael focused on different spatial contexts. You know, what does it mean at an EU level or a nation state or a regional government level? We focused on what it means in different sectors, like what does it mean to have unfair health inequalities versus unfair education inequalities? And they are, I think, often very different in terms of, so for example, there's much more focus in education on the role of individual motivation. So not every inequality in education is unfair because it's about motivation. Now, I think you do sometimes hear that kind of language of individual motivation with health, but it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same focus on character. The second thing we look on is this idea of policymaking complexity. So our question would be, can governments actually produce these rapid and radical changes to policy and policymaking that they talk about? Now, I suppose I'm trying not to be negative under Michael's chairing, but I think almost every study of policy studies from the start until today say no, they can't do that. And but there are two distinctions in terms of the explanation for what's going on there. The first is, when campaigners talk about the obstacles to rapid, radical, fair policy change, they're talking about the choice to maintain different policymaking arrangements that can constrain or facilitate new changes. So they're talking about who should be responsible for these things, or the wrong people are responsible for these things. But what we tend to focus on is the necessity of these arrangements in which policy problems and policy processes, they're always out of the full knowledge and control of governments, regardless of who does what and which governments are in charge. There are always these necessary limits to policymaking understandings that prompts them to delegate most policymaking to lots of different policy communities across government. The second thing we do is we identify that this is my favorite thing to do if you like to slip in negative conclusions to a positive looking case. We identify these best case scenario countries that seem to be doing the best at these kind of things. And inevitably, in most cases, it's Nordic experiences that are described in Europe as best cases. The welfare states most conducive to reducing inequality, their commitment to different forms of government conducive to a lot of the language and kind of fairness policy making about sharing responsibilities between national and local. And what we find from those best cases is that they largely provide cautionary tales. So, for example, in the health and all policies, health inequalities examples, it would be the Nordic experiences like Norway or Finland that are the ones that people look at for the most optimistic accounts. But they tend to be the ones that provide the most evidence about the difference between high ambition and low delivery. And so almost everything that's published research on health and all policies in these countries focuses on a kind of shopping list of reasons why it didn't happen. Then we identify a more general problem of mainstreaming equity initiatives into routine government business. So Emily will talk later about gender mainstreaming, but the idea of mainstreaming is also apparent in health, this idea that health, think about health in everything you do rather than think about it in a health context. And I think the general problem there is that whenever you sort of mainstream any idea into routine government business, it becomes co-opted and the meaning becomes changed. And that is quite prominent in health, but it's a routine feature of government. Okay, the final question is, do governments actually want to? I'm conscious now. I've gone past 5 minutes, haven't I? I'm playing for time until the final question is: do governments want to pursue rapid and radical changes? We know that they say they do, but do they actually mean it when they say it? And I suppose that there are lots of things. So we don't really come to conclusions on this, but we just give you both sides of this. So we would say that this attachment to a very ambitious, ambiguous rhetoric is common across Europe. The European Commission is very keen on that kind of language of mainstreaming and doing the right thing and fairness and that sort of thing. And it could signal the desire to change things, or it could provide a way to describe that desire safe in the knowledge that it won't happen. I think if I was a policymaker, I would use that language because I know that it just wouldn't come to anything. So it can be a sincere attempt to reform policymaking, or it can be a cynical attempt to incorporate that language into routine government business. You can take your pick. And it comes, I think the key final point is, it comes in very different forms. I think in education, for example, people make this distinction between so-called neoliberal and so-called social justice approaches to equity. They both claim to want fairness in education or other fields, but they do it in a very different way with a very different lens. So the neoliberal kind of attempt would be to prompt fairness by focusing on individual motivation and responsibility. Social justice approaches would very much focus on state responsibility for equity. So there's a good example there in terms of the Scottish context. Would Scottish education be fairer in an independent Scotland? Well, that could mean in relation to social justice. So shift your focus from performance of schools towards redistributing income and wealth, addressing poverty, because most causes of inequality in education are to do with out-of-school factors rather than school performance. Or would it simply be a less bad version of current neoliberal approaches in the UK? And I suppose my answer to that one is, I think that the Scottish Government is promoting the less bad version of policy rather than signalling fairness in terms of a completely different approach to policy. But that would be a segue to Sean. Emily, do you want Sean to go just now? And, yeah. Oh, okay. So Sean can play for time. You've essentially got, I think, until.
Thank you. That's a useful tee up, and I'm going to sort of expand on some of the themes that Paul has talked about in terms of education. I'm hoping for a sort of stirring musical accompaniment. Maybe the national instrument of the meso-level territory of Scotland. So yeah, we looked into education inequality, education equity as a part of this this project, and we carried out a sort of large-scale systematic review, essentially, which is essentially looking at a large number of academic texts which deal with questions of education equity. And a lot of these themes that have been mentioned by Charlotte and Michael and Paul about sort of competing definitions, about different operationalizations of these definitions being used in different contexts really comes out. So you have kind of a wide degree of disagreement about what we actually mean by educational inequity or educational inequality, which is quite contextually defined and differentiated. So for all of that, we can identify two broad narratives in explaining educational equity, which sort of arise from different country studies and different academic literature more generally. So those are, as Paul says, neoliberal and social justice. So I think my most useful use of time here will probably be to sort of go into a little bit more depth about the difference between these two things, and then maybe try and apply them a bit to the Scottish example. So neoliberal approaches tend to be dominant within education policy networks, which is a difference with the high-up literature where it's generally seen as a kind of externality. So this is something that people who are in those education networks that Paul identifies as being key to policy making more generally exist. So there's also a sort of high degree of commitment within international organizations, although that's a slightly more complicated picture that I don't necessarily have the time to go into. But it emphasizes, in short, education's role as being a kind of largely instrumental good linked to economic outputs, arguments around human capital, and about the sort of potential that education has to prepare people for the workplace, things of that nature. And it sees education as best being delivered by what we'll call quasi-market mechanisms, but a set of policy solutions which essentially arise from what Michael was discussing in terms of new public management, which is things like choice in schools, the partnership with private and charitable organisations. School vouchers would be a sort of typical example, and something like academy schools in England might be a sort of more close to home kind of example. The state's role is viewed as being to kind of provide a level playing field, essentially, to sort of remove barriers to opportunity, and that's where that kind of individual responsibility argument that Paul was making comes in as well. And it advocates policies, like I say, such as performance management, school vouchers, school and pupil rankings, streaming or tracking within schools from quite a young age. So that's the sort of, in the literature, they're the kind of bad guys. That's the sort of the approach which undermines efforts towards educational equity, even though it purports to solve it. Social justice approaches, meanwhile, are more likely to emphasize the sort of emancipatory, well-being, social value of education, and perhaps maybe lean more on the kind of intrinsic value of education as a public good. There's a strong emphasis here on out-of-school factors such as poverty or parental unemployment, socioeconomic inequality more broadly, even down to things like environmental air quality and things like that. The social justice approach views these as all having a significant bearing on the differences and gaps that we sort of see as manifesting educational inequality. It considers that education should be delivered largely by the state, by public institutions, and rejects the sort of involvement of private sector organisations. And it sort of rejects, in terms of the policy interventions that it promotes, it's more about a rejection of those new public management approaches. So things like rejecting a demanding schedule of assessment, seeking to avoid students repeating years when they fail, placing limitations on the involvement of the private sector in education more generally. So almost all the studies that we looked at criticised the sort of damaging impact of neoliberal definitions of equity and the performance management and quasi market techniques that support it, on the grounds that while they purport to address inequality, they tend to actually increase it. And Michael made that point about there not being a kind of neutral delivery mechanism, and this would see those delivery mechanisms as contributing to inequality. So to bring it back to the UK context, I'm probably going to repeat what Paul said about tempering expectations somewhat. Since devolution, we've seen a quite significant divergence in some respects in education policy between the English system and the Scottish system. Most of that change is actually English policymakers gravitating more towards this neoliberal vision of education policy in terms of things like academy schools, sort of quite rigorous testing and so on and so forth. Whereas Scotland has kind of plodded on with the arrangements with sort of different policies coming in within that sort of existing structure. So a sort of short way of saying that Scotland's aligned more closely with that social justice image, but to an extent it's a sort of hybrid, with elements of both approaches. So, you can sort of try and find a best case country to sort of try and emulate. If you're talking about the context of Scottish independence, perhaps, what should independent Scotland do to address educational inequalities? And the sort of temptation would be to point to this social justice playbook and say, let's try and, emulate a country like Finland, which is probably the closest realization of that approach. But you're dealing with issues of politics, like Charlotte mentions. How do you get there? How do you get to a position where you're, say, giving significantly more money to pupils in Paisley than you are to pupils in Morningside? Is that an easy thing to do politically? I'll leave that up to you to decide. There's also a high degree for these efforts to be undermined, even if they were to be enacted, by policy incoherence across the Scottish government. Then you have the additional factor of international issues, and of course the UK government as a kind of constraining effect in terms of influencing those out-of-school factors. So I'll bring it back to the sort of one of the core conclusions of the book, really, which is that we see across a number of different countries and contexts a high commitment to educational inequality, but we still see a substantial gap between those stated aspirations and then what actually occurs on the ground. So, yeah, thanks.
So I'm last. I was going to be penultimate, but I'm ultimate primarily because of childcare breakdown. So it's a perfect segue to talk about gender equality. Actually, I think it's the order of the chapters in the book as well. Gender equality comes after education and health. And so it's interesting because it allowed me to kind of reflect and echo certain findings from health and education, and then find a different twist when it comes to gender inequality. And where we depart with that is the fact that there is a wealth of information that gender equality is good across the board for raising, for example, health outcomes, economic productivity, education outcomes. It's just good for everybody, and there's overwhelming academic, sustained empirical academic knowledge about this, and yet a very big gap, apparently, in terms of delivering it. And so when we did the review of essentially anything that's ever been written on gender equality, we found this rather similar narrative across the literature, no matter where people were from, no matter what system they were looking at, and no matter what territorial level they were looking at as well, which essentially is that gender equality has come to be something that is routinely embraced by political and policy actors at all levels. It's endorsed and associated with modern government, i.e. you would not want to be seen to not agree that gender equality is a good thing. But then on the ground, there seems to be a big mismatch between that high rhetorical commitment and then what's being done. And so we use similar sort of conceptual metaphors to try and figure out what's going on. And the first one is this question of ambiguity, which is essentially that we don't agree on what gender inequality means, which would make sense. We've just talked about how we don't agree on what health inequality would mean, or unfair health inequalities, or education. But when it comes to gender, it plays on two levels. We don't agree about what equality would look like, and we also don't agree on what gender means. So putting the two together actually ends up opening up kind of double the box of ambiguity that, for example, health and education do. And so this sort of need to doubly interpret both those terms in order to make sense of it for policy action is visible across sectors and at all levels as well. What you tend to find is three models that are not necessarily exclusive. They can be put together. A very kind of low bar model of statutory equality, which is simply having laws that say that people are equal, and adding gender as one of those dimensions across which people are equal. You can also add other sort of social locations and categories of difference like disability, age, and so forth, but gender is one of those meaningful ones. But you don't do more than that. And essentially, you place on the individual the responsibility to seek some kind of redress if they're discriminated against. But there's nothing proactive necessarily being done. Then you have much more, at the other end of the spectrum, much more proactive policies that identify a particular gender group, usually women, as deserving of some kind of special assistant or special program or policy of difference, not because they're inherently special necessarily, but because of a sense of historic inequality, historic discrimination having to be kind of repaired structurally in order to make them or make up that gap, right? So that is the second one. And the third one actually has less to do with policies themselves and more about reforming the way that we make policies. And that's where in the kind of 1990s we saw a huge ascendancy in the primacy of the concept of gender mainstreaming. And gender mainstreaming wasn't necessarily about putting concrete policy instrument or policy design ideas in policymakers' heads. It was about getting them to think about how making policy itself, the institutions, the actors, and the processes themselves contributed to gender inequality, and how not only did we have to make good policies that had substantive equality outcomes, but we also had to consider our own efforts within these systems to better understand, better negotiate, better agree on what equality should look like and how we should reach it. So you have these three models, and we've seen sort of historical trends and patterns for some of them. The EU, for example, at a supranational level, was for a good long while one of the shining lights of gender equality. But we've also seen contexts, in particular socioeconomic context, push gender back a lot. Whenever something else bigger, more important happens, usually the economy, i.e. financial crises and so forth, gender is still something that political actors, gender equality is always something that political actors say that they are committed to, but suddenly their capacity or their desire, their willingness to act on it instead of tackling the economy, for example, seems to always place it second. which is contrary to this idea that, you know, we should mainstream gender in all decisions, a bit like health mainstreaming and high up as well. So we looked at how the meaning can definitely be a problem. We looked at how the level at which you know, policy making or policies are delivered matter as well, because they either require translation from, you know, ideas at the top, very vague ideas that generate a great deal of commitment, precisely because they don't mean very much. So there's a low political cost, right? Saying I agree with you, then having to be translated into concrete policies where suddenly you have to haggle on budgets and you have to haggle on design and so forth. Or you leave it up to local areas to come up with place-appropriate, culture-appropriate, regionally appropriate policies that they think will work, and risk this kind of postcode lottery of policies where essentially we see some good patterns in some places and in other places we don't, right? So one of the other dimensions that we do, in, you know, that we carry out analytically in all of the chapters that I'll use my time to speak about is whether or not, or to what extent there's any evidence of learning between either levels or between countries or between regions and so forth. And with gender, you very clearly see a strong pattern of certain countries being identified as ideal typical, mostly the Nordic countries, essentially, where everybody wants to be like Sweden. And there's lots of good reasons to want to be like Sweden. They definitely, you know, score quite well on a lot of the metrics that matter when it comes to gender equality, but it's no gender nirvana either. So gender equality in that sense has not been reached anywhere. And what we see instead is countries essentially narrowing down or having a very narrow sense of where to look to for ideas, which is usually Europe, usually Northern Europe, and completely kind of ignoring other regions where there may be very valuable lessons to learn. So we see, for example, a growing interest in the literature on Latin America, which is a region that has put forward some of the most important or decisive laws dealing with violence against women in politics, right? Very narrow, but we're not learning from Latin America. We're still kind of following that Nordic dream, even though we've kind of plateaued, even Sweden and so forth have plateaued. So it's not, hopefully it's a kind of middle story where I'm not too depressing. A lot of progress has been made, but what we're noticing is this plateau. And in some cases, a plateau actually can lead to retrenchment very quickly because you have to maintain a plateau, right? You have to work very hard just to keep things as the status quo. So actually we're seeing all of those actors that are the same in education and health, all those civil society actors, third sector actors, having to use all their resources just to maintain the status quo without necessarily being able to go forward.
Okay, thanks, Emily, and to everybody else. We've covered an awful lot there, so the only thing to do is go away and get the book, and as Paul says, it's going to be available online for free. Yep, that'll be out shortly. So can we open it now to the floor? And if anybody who's listening online has got any question, can you put that in the comment box and we'll pick that up shortly. Richard.
Hello, I'm Richard Harry of Edinburgh University. Really interesting, and what I picked up, and it'd be wonderful to read the book, of course, which I haven't done, so that's an important thing to say first of all, but the link between rhetoric and action, you know, that there are systems which can do words really well, but the action they can do isn't that much. So you need to link these two up, and it's a hard thing to do. And I'm just thinking that, you know, during COVID, we've had political systems, often at the nation states level, we see this in the US and the UK, where there's been huge transfers of income and money, huge transfers. They've been able to do it because they can raise some taxes and incur, but borrowing as well, and these are added up in a sense. Each of them is needed. But in political systems which aren't at the level of the nation state, this isn't there. So that applies to the EU. They are not typically very much at all transferring money to individuals, or even to areas. Actually, there is a lot more of that. And then at the meso level also, they are not transferring money to individuals. That's been at the heart of devolution in Britain, actually, that all the transfer has been done at the UK level, but it's changing. And the interesting thing in Scotland in recent years, and it'll happen more and more, is that there is more transfers, that there is more money being transferred to individuals by the Scottish government as opposed to the UK government. And this is actually really going to change the whole medium term strategy in a way, and in recent weeks we have seen an actual medium-term fiscal strategy issued by the Scottish government. And the interesting thing of it is that for the first time income transfers are becoming a big issue, and are kind of driving everything else, because it is within the power of the Scottish government to give real money to individuals to have their own social security agency, which they do, and in order to make this a worthwhile exercise, there needs to be real change in a way. People need to be given extra. That's what it comes down to. And so there needs to be an increase in that budget in real terms. All the benefits which have in theory been devolved, but up until now haven't been changed because they're still basically run from England. You would say, in broad terms, they are going to be devolved. They'll become a bit more generous, and then that has to be paid for. So what I'm actually asking is, how can we bring the rhetoric and the action into the balance? And if we do, will this cause strains in the overall public finances, which will be hard to bear? And I'm wondering if in all of this, certainly the UK can learn from other systems within Europe, which, as Michael's indicating, have been a little bit in on this earlier. They've been able to do more earlier. I'm just wondering if we can learn from them.
Paul, can I have a go at that?
Okay, well, I mean, I suppose it allows me to describe what our original focus was when it wasn't Scotland until recently. So the agenda we were looking at was this idea of making sense of the idea of spatial justice. So there should be some level of fairness about something across Europe and to do with regions. And I suppose I think the premise was that the European Union or Commission had focused very much on economic fairness for a long time and not really gotten very far. You know, they had structural funds and such like, and it wasn't producing the results they had. So their new, I was going to say wheeze there, that's not the right word, but their new idea was to find non-economic means to promote fairness across Europe. And so that would be, for example, the thing that struck me in terms of the language people used was fairness in terms of a perception of fairness in relation to things like public services. So do you feel like you have the same access to the health service or education service or something like that? Or do you feel that there is procedural fairness, that you can pursue these aims through a government that you identify with or something like that? So I suppose for me that would be, you know, if you're being a little bit cynical, you would say when lots of governments are trying to promote a sense of fairness that is not engaged with the most difficult one, which is redistribution. So can we reduce health inequalities without redistributing income and wealth? Can we do the same with education? And I think lots of government, I think, you know, in terms of learning, if it doesn't have to be like a great lesson, then I think we learned that lots of governments like that language of fairness as an alternative to the kinds of things you would associate. You know, I think when you ask people what would be the first thing you think of when you think of fairness, you know, in terms of outcomes, it would be redistribution of income and wealth, stopping those or halting or preventing those major inequalities that you talked about. But I don't think we've detected many governments that are really interested in doing that. They want to do the other stuff. They want to give you a language of you know, political reform. that they can sell as a fairness agenda that would then allow them to avoid the economic one.
Yeah, if I just add something to that about rhetoric and telling stories. Well, a lot of policy making is about telling stories. That's creating these beliefs. And at the moment we've got the levelling up agenda, which is one of the less meaningful stories that are being told there, because it implies that nobody's going to lose out. You can do all this without redistributing, which of course is just nonsense. And what is being levelled up anyway? So we've got an initiative in the RSC with the Welsh and the Irish academies about this, and we're hesitating as to whether to call it levelling up, because we think the concept is meaningless, but then that is the political agenda. So we've got to put it there somewhere and then starting reconstructing it. But then what happens to put that into policy? What happens, then it becomes all about real politics and negotiation and interest mediation and all the other kinds of things. It doesn't just happen. And that's something we were looking at as well. What are these social partners or social competitors there? What is the relationship between capital and labour at different levels? It does vary between different levels. What is the balance of power there? Where do the social interests come in there? And it's just an opportunity to say what I'm always saying about Scotland. You've got what I call this sectoral corporatism, and I've sat in this room, and many of you have done as well in these rooms, where all the social policy people talk to each other and agree, and the economic people talk to agree, and the environmental people, they don't talk to each other, make those trade-offs. That's where the really difficult stuff happens. And that's actually quite typical, although in other countries they do have institutionalized mechanisms for social mediation. In Tuscany, in central Italy, for example, they have these tavole di concertazione, consultation. So all the policies at least go through that kind of neo-corporatist mechanism. And difficult decisions have to be made. And the other critical point is, if you are engaging in a social investment, gender equality is good for the economy, we know that, and health spending is good for the equality. But can you recuperate those benefits? Do those come back to the government that's making that spending? And, for example, Quebec has a very generous childcare policy. It's had it for decades, but it only recovers a tiny percentage of the additional revenues that are generated by getting women into the workforce. So the incentives are sometimes in the wrong place, and you don't get the right distribution of competence. And I think we're probably in that position too in a bit, because we've got a distribution of competence and these new welfare powers that were done because the parties haggled with each other, and I want a bit more of that, and I want a bit less than that, and they ended up with, but if somebody was designing a welfare mix for Scotland, they wouldn't have ended up in this place. That's where the politics kind of got in the way. Any other comments on that particular one?
I think there's one that I would say, which is that I think it's also important not to assume that that talk is not a valuable policy instrument. We often associate, we talk about it in terms of stories if we're talking about the politics of it, but actually vague, non-binding types of policy instruments that come out of these stories, out of this talk, can be useful. We tend to associate them with weak politics, weak policy. If we really wanted to do something about it, we'd do something hard. We'd, ban something. We'd put a cost on something. But in cases, especially as you go up and you have, for example, at the EU level, more partners to try to bring together at the table, more partners to get into consultation, getting people to agree on some broad, non-binding instrument can usually be a good way to, for example, set an agenda or soften up, the actors over time to perhaps, accepting harder instruments later. So the gap between rhetoric and action, I think, can also sometimes, not in all cases, be considered a temporal lag, perhaps, or we should consider them a temporal lag. We should always be questioning, if this has been agreed at a rhetorical level, does it mean that nobody's going to do anything about it? Or instead, are we seeing what we should be seeing behind the scenes to translate that agenda over time into something concrete?
Yeah.
So, Derek, I was very interested in this point that you were making about the dislocation between rhetoric and action. And I wonder if, firstly, there's a political reason why, which might explain that, but if it's particularly acute or relevant in Scotland. The political one I'm thinking of is, there are examples of where there have been, you might say, dramatic changes in the distribution question. So you think of Britain before Thatcher disrupted the pre-war consensus for levels of personal taxation were in the high 80%. In the Nordic countries, I think the highest level of tax, probably 15 to 20% higher than it is here. can do dramatic things. The appeal, I wonder, of the more incremental thing is it's much harder to identify who the relative winners and losers are. So it would be a bold or courageous political strategy for a government to say we're going to do something very dramatic quite suddenly, because there would be very strong resistance from those who lose out. I wonder if that factor, if that's true, is particularly relevant in Scotland because of the nature of, without trying to be partisan about it, our current government has been in power for 15 years now. The organising principle that brings them together is not reducing inequality necessarily, it's constitutional change. And having seen the results of the last referendum, it would be a bold strategy to do something dramatic on the redistribution front, whilst at the same time trying to win over 50% of the population to back the idea of independence. You look at the results of the 2014 referendum, many of the areas, local authority areas, which had the highest levels of inequality were already quite strongly in favour of independence. So if that support is already there, there's perhaps less political advantage, relatively speaking, for a government minded as the current one is, to do the dramatic changes on redistribution in order to secure what their principal ambition is, which is to change people's minds on the constitutional question. So I just wonder if both of these factors tend to mean that we're likely to do the incremental things much more likely than, even if we understand that more dramatic change is possible, there are factors that mean that we wouldn't adopt that approach. Any comments on that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good analysis. I mean, I would say generally, I mean, there's work in the literature on policy making which talks about the way that incrementalism is kind of the default setting, if you like, of policy making, in the sense that, you know, Paul was talking about policy communities, and there's this sort of logic of delegation. Essentially, if you think about a busy policymakers day, you know, you think about the large amount of things that's got to be crammed into that. They can only really focus on 2 or 3 big ticket things at a time. So they delegate to civil servants, and these policy communities begin to come into play, who, as Michael says, are very good at talking to themselves, but maybe not so good at talking across different policy areas. But the result of that really is that most policy making takes place in these policy communities. You know, so in Scotland it might be between educational professional groups in education policy and trade unions and practitioners of various kinds and civil servants. And the result is that, you know, most things tick along outside of policymaker views. If you think about the high level of change that you need to meaningfully address inequalities across the whole range of policy areas, you know, you kind of need some kind of impetus for change. You need a sort of drastic shift in policymaker attention towards some of these issues. And as you say, that's where the political incentives begin to come into play a little bit. And that's why we tend to see big policy changes following seismic events of one kind or another. The referendum, if it's a yes vote, might be an opportunity to do that, but those same policymakers will be committed in one way or another to kind of keeping the show on the road during that period, I think. And I think that's why, you know, Paul mentions a general skepticism or, you know, cynicism or negativity, or however you want to describe it, amongst people who research public policy, and I think that's one of the sort of reasons I would point to.
Dalia, do you have any questions online?
We have no online questions, so that's time to be like thrown back into the room. Anybody else?
Okay.
I have a question for all the panelists. So some of you have already potentially answered it, but you could then repeat it. And the second thing I would ask you have probably not said. So the first thing is, so what is then the most effective policy that would really tackle the causes of the cause, if you have to pick one? And that might, of course, be one that is really from a political point of view totally unrealistic. So it might be the you know, redistribution, like total tax reform or something. So what is then the policy that is sort of, you know, in terms of efficiency and feasibilities, you know, somewhere in the middle, that it's the most realistic, that will ideally not be the best and most efficient one, but will be, you know, making the most inroad. Does that make sense? So 2 policies, one which is the most effective, but probably totally unrealistic, and then what is your alternative to achieve at least something and, you know, hopefully achieve it?
You want us to solve inequality right now, tonight. We can do this.
Let's do it.
I believe in it.
Health inequality or education inequality or as such, that is up to you. I don't know.
It's a big one. The short answer is I don't think that it is possible to answer the first question without including politics. That is to say, you would not be able to get a kind of technocratic answer that says this is the instrument that will, for example, in my case, gender equality, that will liberate people from the strictures of unfair gender inequalities. Because on the one hand, you have a community of practitioners and researchers who believe that it is possible to reform existing structures and existing systems to lead them to produce better outcomes for gender equality, and then others who essentially say we have to burn it to the ground. And those two communities don't fundamentally agree, even though they're both kind of paving the way or hoping that they're moving towards the same outcome. So the question becomes, are the instruments that we are equipped with even capable of producing the outcomes that we want them to? Or is using, the master's tools simply going to reproduce the same entrenched inequalities? The other thing is the complexity issue, definitely, that Charlotte brought up, which is the fact that, for example, if we consider gender equality, people who have spent serious amount of time thinking about what that might mean consider that it's not possible to reach gender equality without reaching equality in all other meaningful social categories, which means that you couldn't still live in a racist society or an ableist one or an ageist one, which means you need to be fixing all inequalities at the same time, which is, again, not easily solved with this one instrument. So then it's a question of policy design and coherence, which I think is what Sean was saying as well. How, instead of one instrument, can we possibly design a mixture of instruments? And I think there's a neat way of looking at it, which is not to think of it at any point in time, today, how do these things work for the outcomes that we'll give tomorrow, but over time in complex systems, as they shift incentives and behaviors, are these the best suited to work well over time together? So I wonder if the answer to your second kind of question coming from me would be, it'll be a mix of efficiency instruments that actually are coherent over time, rather than coherent necessarily at a single point in time, which is hard to get.
Yes, I'm going to try and answer, or at least give my opinion on this question, but I feel like it's almost a trick question because I can't commit to, it's such a complex, difficult issue. I'll start with the second one, and because I feel like this might be kind of smoother to lead up to, but with respect to health inequalities, I would be almost tempted to say that we should stop talking about health inequalities because that obscures the fact that it's socioeconomic inequalities, and it's almost acts as an avenue to technocratize and kind of make it more neutral, make it depoliticize it. So I think a first step, or a realistic step, I would hope, would be to really kind of talk about redistribution, regulation, and public spending, at least kind of make that conversation even possible again, because it feels like this is, there are some roundabout ways to talk about this without talking about this. So I feel like this could be like a first good start. And in terms of radical policy that, might not happen, but that would be good. I mean, again, I also don't think there is a one kind of silver bullet solution, but I would like to place my hope in the kind of policies like universal basic incomes or these sorts of directions to really kind of decommodify labor. I feel like health inequalities lie much more in fiscal policy measures. I mean, addressing them lies much more there, and the relationship between precarity at work, income inequality, wealth inequality, and poor health is such that I feel like we need to tackle that and improve health like this. Yeah. Right.
John, have you got a big idea?
No, probably not. I'm going to sort of say something which will probably betray my political leaning slightly. I suppose we're all inequality interested here. But I think to stick to the education side, I think, and this is my realistic one, which gives you a sense of how difficult this is, would be, if we're to just stick to the themes I've been discussing, would be sort of serious limitations on private education. I think that's a really big driver of inequality in the education system. And Finland, as I mentioned, one of the features of its education approach has been to put pretty strict limits on what they can do, how much money they can make, and the extent to which they have to take on the kind of national curriculum and things like that. I don't think that's realistic in the UK. Maybe it's slightly more realistic in Scotland. I don't know. I'll leave you to be the judge of that. But I think it would be quite impactful. And it doesn't feel like it's something that's going to be wildly expensive or anything like that. It's a legal tweak rather than something which would involve sort of mass confiscation of wealth. Which brings me on to my second idea, which would be probably something around sort of maximum earnings or maximum wealth, I think, and that sort of speaks to what Charlotte's saying about fiscal measures. You know, I don't know how you do that really through the tax system, perhaps, or through some sort of secret police. I'm not sure, but it would be something that would really meaningfully make a difference. But it's also, I think, probably the technical challenges to that, let alone the political challenges to achieving that, I think, really give you a sense of how difficult tackling inequalities would be. So yeah, I'd sort of propose those as my two ideas, but would do so safe in the knowledge that both of them are probably politically impossible and technically either very difficult or also completely impossible.
So, I mean, just to stick with health and education, I think there is this language, I think, in health of this best buys. You know, what are if you could only buy a certain number of things, what would be at the top, that sort of thing. And I think there is a contrast in sort of public health between that focus that Charlotte talks about, which is saying health inequalities are really socioeconomic, but there's also this other focus on preventing so-called non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancers, diabetes, respiratory diseases, through more interventionist measures. So I think whenever kind of preventive health is seen as the non-success story, tobacco control in the UK is often presented as the success story that any other part of public health can learn from. And I think that is, so the argument there is that smoking is the biggest contributor to the unequal spread of NCDs because of the unequal spread of smoking. So the solution there, the more realistic solution there, is if you can't redistribute income and wealth, is to limit smoking. So through a succession of measures, and I think when people talk about the success story there, it is through this incremental process, but it's this paradigm change over 30 years from where we were in the 80s compared to where we are now. I mean, I think that is one example. If I am kind of pressed to come up with examples of times when things have changed in a fundamental way, it is things like smoking. But at the same time, there's a difference there between, levels of smoking in the population and that being a success, and still those residual inequalities in levels of smoking, which still remain. In terms of education, the OECD thinks about this a lot in the way that you talk about. So they have these really interesting reports that essentially say, maybe redistribution would be the best thing for education, but we recognise that it's not feasible, so here's what you can do instead. They very much engage with that kind of question. And I think they pretty much say, in terms of funding, redistribute spending on schools so that you can essentially spend more on schools in more deprived areas. But then they've got this other list of more performance-related things about because they're associated with the sense that countries try and compete with each other for schools and that sort of thing. But they really focus on things like building an evidence base to say that the worst thing you can do is make students repeat a year. The worst thing you can do for inequalities is to separate pupils into different streams according to ability, because that raises the high ability and exacerbates inequalities. So there is this kind of notional evidence base on what to do if you accept that you're only focusing on schools and not anything that happens before them.
Okay, my big idea, which is politically impossible, is reform local taxation. We've got a local taxation system in this country which is socially unjust and economically inefficient at the same time. And there's an idea being around for about 150 years, land value taxation would actually address that, because governments have bungled this so often that every time they think of doing it, they'll just run away. That would require the parties all to jump together. At the other end, feasible and incremental, this minimum income guarantees, which is not quite the same, it's not as ambitious as universal basic income or citizens' income. That's actually been a pretty effective way of using modest amounts of resources to fill in the welfare state, to deal with people who are really at the bottom, and to raise people at the bottom. There are all sorts of other payments. The child support payment in Scotland, for example, are examples of that too. Very targeted measures that are not terribly expensive, but pick on particular groups that are not only in serious trouble, but are politically popular, because nobody can complain about child payments. So there's an incremental way of doing it, or there's a big bang, which I think what you were getting at in your question there. But the dilemma is always what is politically feasible. And the point, I think, as Derek made here about Scotland at the moment, there's a tendency towards catch-all politics. We have catch-all parties for various reasons, including the independence thing. So who is willing to upset anybody? Yeah.
Just continuing from what you said, would you say it's logical that the Scottish Government has committed to spending on devolved social security to the extent that it needs to make hundreds of millions of savings in what it spends in other policy areas in a year, if its aim is to reduce health inequality, education inequality, gender inequality?
Yeah. And there's one answer to that, which is stop handing out freebies to old people like me. I don't have a bus pass. I feel really bad about it. But there are all kinds of stuff that go to people who just don't need it. But we know, because it's the people like my age who vote, and young people don't vote. That's the political explanation of that. Well, I think we come to the end of the formal proceedings here, so we can stop the live stream there. But you're all invited to join us for a glass of wine or other refreshments.